Thank you. Thanks. My husband suggested I should actually have a beard and ask if there were any women present, but I won't do that. And Simon also suggested that instead of using instead of time as my title, I should have perhaps said Vikki the Tree Torturer. So just that'll give you, I guess, a bit of an indication as to what I'm going to talk about over the next half an hour or so. And I guess, though, to follow on a bit from what Ted started with this morning, I mean, I am an ecologist, so, you know, maybe I'm a cat amongst the pigeons here, I'm not sure. But I've always been fascinated by understanding trees and their evolutionary history. Why do they do what they do? And watching them, looking at them, and I know all of you in the room do the same. And it's been one of the great privileges that I've had over the last 25, 30 years, working with tree people and observing what we see and trying to interpret what we see. So I think for me, this kind of whole idea of trees responding to what I would call natural disasters or browsers, that we've got both of those things. And I guess the question we would all ask ourselves is, which one of those do we fall into? Well, I think today I'm well and truly a natural disaster, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So I did talk to the conference about 6 years ago, a very short presentation about veteranization. So Simon wanted me to just briefly go through again, just for those of you who don't remember, because I know that most people remember about 5% of presentations that are given at conference, so especially on Wednesday morning. So what is veteranization? Why and how do we do it? Where do we do it? Does it work? I guess that's the million-dollar question. A few conclusions in the future. This is one of my favorite trees at Hatfield Forest, a pollarded hornbeam. So what is veteranization? Well, I think torturing trees, perhaps, is the term we might use, but actually it's a nature conservation tool. And we see it as damaging live young trees. And we're not aiming to kill them, just for them to suffer. And it's absolutely never on veteran trees. And that, you know, that's a really important point. I've heard people describe veteranization in all sorts of different ways. And I just want that to be really clear today, that we're talking about using younger trees that we might otherwise remove. And it's nothing new, actually. We've been doing it for about 4,000 years by pollarding. And I think that's where some of the inspiration for me came along, that looking at pollards and seeing that they seem to be hollowing much more quickly than other trees or open-grown trees. But the Aussies are doing it for parakeets, Ted, actually. In America, they've done some work creating cavities and trying to see what birds were using them. I know in Italy, they've done some work on Quercus rubra. So, you know, there's been this kind of co-evolution going on over the last 2 or 3 decades with people thinking along the same lines. And then I absolutely loved, did you see Planet Earth with the bears? Yeah, please, you know, the whole kind of rubbing themselves up against the trees. Well then, actually at the same time as I saw that, there's a paper being published about bears as ecological engineers. So I'd like to think of all of us in the room today as being ecological engineers, that the role we play in an ecosystem is just as important as the bears, but we might use other tools. So again, coming back to this point about mimicking nature, I'm an ecologist, so I'm interested in trees, but I'm also interested in everything that lives on them. How do they get there? Why do they get there? What brings them there? And I hope that some of the work that we've been doing with veteranization might also teach us more about those relationships. This is just an example of a site in North Spain where they've been topping stroke pollarding, and the trees they've got, you know, internal roots, they've got hollows and holes, they've got wet pockets, but the trees are probably only about 120, 130 years old. They grow faster. There's quite a lot of rain in that part of Spain. But it just was a real fantastic site to go and run about. I mean, Duncan yesterday was talking about all the photographs he's collecting. Well, I'm collecting lots of photographs of trees that have been damaged. And I'm not going to say anything about municipal tree surgery, of course, but, you know, there are lots of good examples of work. Simon even said to me in the pub on Sunday night that his early years were making sure after tree pruning that you couldn't see that any trees had been pruned or any branches had been there. I guess that's what I'm doing now as well, so it's great, reinventing wheels. So why do we need to veteranize? I'm going to do this quite quickly, so, you know, keep up. We've got sites with old trees, and many of you know that lots of those sites have just got a few trees left. and they're small, they're isolated. I mean, those of us working with nature conservation know basically we're buggered because the sites we're protecting are just not enough. They're far too small, isolated. We've got vast areas of agricultural land and forestry land which is hostile to biodiversity. And we've got age gaps. So we may have 5 old, fantastic trees and then nothing. 200-300-year age gaps. We know we're losing species, and we know we're losing species we don't even know about. And it's scary. And then we've got tree diseases. You know, ash dieback. In Sweden, we've got Dutch elm disease that we're facing now, much later. You know, oak. I mean, I don't want to depress you, but these are the problems that we're facing, you know, with regards to the long-term future of our very special and our most special trees. And to quote Ted, you know, they're our rainforest. So I guess the point is time is not on our side. And I think that's where I'm coming from, that, you know, what can we do? I'm impatient. I want to see results. I want to try and do something. And I'm sure that's something we all share. And just last week, we were in Sweden, and we were a bunch of people climbing about in this absolutely, I think the technical term is stonking ash. I mean, it was just absolutely amazing. I think it was about 9.5 meters round, and it's succumbed to ash dieback in the last 12 months. And, you know, it's got a list of red data book species as long as your arms and legs. But, you know, it's got a time limit as to how long it's going to be there. I mean, it'll hopefully be there another couple of 100 years, but it's not going to produce any new habitat, that particular tree. And then, just to wind Ted up, I've put a picture of beetles in. Those of you will know Ted likes to call beetle people pin stickers. But actually, you know, I work in Sweden, and this particular beetle earns every year around about 5 million euros for nature conservation. So I bow to the beetle right now. This one, hermit beetle, we don't have it in the UK, and I keep meaning to bring it over in my rucksack. And the work that's, you know, there's been some work done across Europe regarding the ecology of these species. And the bit that frightens me is in 2012, there was a report produced by the IUCN, and they said 11% of saprophilic beetles are under threat. 2018, they published a new report, and it's gone up to 18%. And it's really scary. You know, that's all happening fast around us while we're sitting here having a lovely time drinking beer. And it is one of the most threatened species community in Europe. I'd like to say that we know that's probably true for all the other communities associated with old trees, but beetles, we've actually got some data and knowledge. So where do we do it? Well, this is a lovely site we also visited last week in Sweden. Beautiful, ancient oak tree with a whole bunch of tree nerds running around trying to find more. Well, there weren't any more. There was this one. I think there was one other on this site. So where do we do veteranization? It's these kind of places where we've got 1 or 2 few old trees, and then we've got lots of these kind of trees. And Reg, you'll recognize yourself there on that picture. So I'd say these trees, and I'm sorry to those of you that are foresters in the room, boring, lollipop, straight trees without anything interesting going on if you're an ecologist. They are the kind of trees that are just perfect for doing this kind of torturing work too. But back to this point about, you know, how do we do it and what do we do? It's using nature as our guide. The picture on the right here, you can see, I don't know if the pointer works, that's a black woodpecker hole, but you can see there's a branch that's ripped off. It's got some nice decay happening there. Well, you know, how does this happen? It's wind damage probably in this particular instance, but we don't actually know all the processes that lead up to that particular. And the black woodpecker is the only woodpecker that will actually make holes in live wood. So, you know, what's coming first, the woodpecker or the decay? We don't really know the answer to that. So, you know, one of the techniques we've been looking at is ring barking large branches, because on oak we know, for example, that shade creates that kind of environment. We also know that dead branches that are shaded out, which then fall off, are often where we get really good cavities with that particular beetle that I showed you before that lives in. So it's using nature as our guide, thinking about, okay, well, these are the sorts of features that we find on our oldest trees that also have some of our rare species in them. How can we recreate those using tools? Now, I say that with the royal we, because often people like Reg and others are the ones helping us out and doing the work. But There are about 20 odd different techniques, and Reg normally every year comes up with a new one. I'm not saying anything more about that, to surprise me. But there may be many more techniques out there, and I just wanted to show you a short film. It's very quiet.
Access within trees much quicker and easier. The small holes made by the spikes are an additional form of damage or veteranisation. This first example involves making a nest box in a living tree. Here, a wedge of wood is removed, the top cut off, and also a slice from the inside of the wedge. It is then replaced as the front of the box. The top of the tree is also removed to ensure that it does not fail where the nest box has been made. Holes can be drilled into live trees to mimic woodpecker holes. Here, 5 are drilled in a row, some 4 centimetres in diameter and 6 centimetres deep. In this technique, the bark, including all living tissue outside the sapwood, is removed from the base of the tree to a height of about 1 metre and mimics horse damage. This stripped area should not exceed 1/3 of the trunk girth. Ring barking causes the slow death of a branch or a tree by interrupting the flow of water and nutrients. In this example, bark and cambium are removed from all around the branch along a length of approximately 20 centimetres. To try and encourage basal decay, the base of the trunk is hit with a sledgehammer over an area which is about 1/3 of the girth up to a height of some 20 centimetres.
I'd just like to say that last one was David Lonsdale's idea. Honestly, it was. There's a whole film, you'll recognise Helen's voice there. Those films we produced as a part of the previous European project that I was project manager for, Vetri. There's some great training material there, so if you're interested, they're all available free and to download. So I'm just going to move on now to, this started, I guess, as something that many of us at different places were doing when we were restoring wood pastures, because it was like, well, why are we felling trees when actually we could do something else with them? So that's really where it started. And for the last 15 or so years, I've been bringing Swedes from Sweden to have a look at nature conservation and wood pasture work in the UK. And I go to Hatfield Forest, where I used to work, and show them some of the trees that we've tortured. And about 6 or 7 years ago, there were 2 of the guys that I was with, a guy called Jonas Edin and Mats Niklasson, and they got me in the bar after we'd been to Hatfield Forest and said, "So Vikki, where's all your data about how well it's worked?" Well, I haven't really got any. What? But you must have done. You must have had controls, and you must have done a certain number of trees, and you must have decided which ones you were going to do, and which direction did you do it? Which cardinal point? How high were they? What was the vitality of the trees before? That's a really good question. So we kind of sat there and drank a few more beers and discussed about, well, actually, this could be a really valuable tool for nature conservation, but to justify the cost, we actually ought to set something up whereby we might be able to get some proper results and share those results. And so around about 2010 and 11, this developed into an idea where we thought, let's get a network of sites. We wanted 10 sites, and we started in Sweden, but I was feeling slightly nationalistic at that point and felt like we needed to get some sites in the UK involved. So in the end, we got 20 sites up and running, and we focused on oak. And the reason we focused on oak is because, as you all know, it's one of the trees that lives longest. It's also one of the trees that has the greatest biodiversity associated with it. And often that's where we've got a big age gap. So this trial was set up in 2012. We had 3 groups of arborists who undertook the work across these 20 sites. We actually damaged 700 trees, and they were all around this kind of size, 25 to 60 centimetres in size, all visibly healthy, all very boring trees in my view, at least at that point. They were all tagged and photographed, and the work was done in the autumn in 2012. And we were a bit, cocky, I suppose, in that we had absolutely no money. We had no support really other than talking to people and persuading them that this was a really good idea. So each of the landowners contributed a bit of money for the work to be done. And we said, yeah, this project's going to go for 25 years. Ha! Yeah, but okay, that's really good to say that, but actually we've got no money, we've got no universities involved, we haven't got any researchers involved and so on, and we just kind of did a bit of a hope and a prayer. So got the work done. And just very quickly, we had a list of about 20 different options to do, and we narrowed it down to 5. And we wanted to have 5 so that we could have lots of repeats and lots of control trees. And we chose some techniques that would be crowd pleasers so that we might kind of, get people interested, but also from an ecological point of view, some techniques that might give us some quick wins and others that will take longer time. So this is the horse damage one that you saw in the film. This is mimicking a broken branch, so ripping that branch collar down the stem if we can, ring barking, branch, creating woodpecker holes, and then this is my absolute favorite, which is creating a hollow inside a living trunk and knocking the top off. So those were the 5 different treatments we tried. And since then, this is kind of like a big snowball. There's been at least 3 European Union LIFE projects. I know it hurts to say European Union, but I'm going to say it again. European Union LIFE projects, which are fantastic for nature conservation. And there's about probably 2,000 trees that are going to be veteranized over the course of the next 5 or 6 years, with a view to doing this in nature conservation sites where wood pasture restoration is the focus. These trees would otherwise be removed. So in my mind, it's a bit of a no-brainer. We're using a material that we have that's there. If we take it away, it's gone forever. So these are some of the other techniques, mimicking lightning strikes, different variations on, hacking a big hole out of the tree, ring barking the top, and these are some of the climbing spikes. It's interesting, actually, that the Swedish arborists that I've worked with have had real trouble doing work on beech, because it's just so nice, they say to me. So using climbing spikes, I'm like, go on, really, really go for it. So it's been, it's also, this completely goes against, doesn't it, pretty much everything that most of you will have learned. And it takes a bit of time to get your head around it. But if you're clear about why you're doing it, and I think that's something that I always come back to with everything we do with regard to old trees and young trees, is using our brain, switching it on, thinking about why we're doing something, what's your objective? Because actually, we can't confine our toolbox. We've got to make our toolbox bigger. And this is one of the techniques that I think makes our toolbox just that little bit bigger. So the next question, of course, the one you're all been waiting for, is does it work? Well, this is me feeling like it was Christmas, because we went round the trees in 2014 with a ladder, climbing up the tree, and it was, honestly, I was so excited. I'm like, going up the ladder, what's going to be in this one, and is it going to bite me? And we've had a red squirrel in them, we've had lots of birds nesting. And in fact, I was kind of, in that sense of trepidation, delighted at seeing that birds had nested in them, but also slightly depressed because they were nesting in them only 1 year after, the following spring, which kind of makes you think, God, we must have so few holes and cavities left in our landscape that they're even using these ones. We also put up these window traps, as they're called, to look at what insects might be flying around and nosing around in our tortured trees. And so we have got some results, actually. And one of the things that was really interesting to me was actually very few trees died. I think it was something Duncan said yesterday, we should trust in trees more. And everything that I've done with this project makes me trust trees more than ever. I've always had a great trust for trees, because actually they've spent 50 million years evolving, and we've spent about 400,000 years, yet we know better. So, and only 3 of them have died. And I've been back to quite a lot of sites this last summer and this summer. I can't help it. It's a bit of an obsession. And no more trees have died. In fact, one's gone, but some idiots felled it. So it's got nothing to do with actually the tree mortality as such. 63% of the nest boxes had at least 1 year's nesting material inside them. 45% of the woodpecker holes I showed you had been used by birds, a third of them for nesting, but a third of them, the rest were used, I think, for overwintering. I mean, in Sweden it's cold in the winter, and the birds all huddle. and they were using these woodpecker holes as a huddle spot. We found evidence that bats had also used them, both for feeding, and I think probably we've under-recorded that because it's a bit tricky to spot them. Sap runs. I mean, it really was like Christmas, because every time you came to a new site, something different had happened. The woodpeckers had hacked off all the bark on the ring-barked branch. There was all sorts of stuff happening. Some of the trees had moved, torsionally, as you might expect, and there was some great cracks and sap runs, so it was fantastic. And this is Reg. This is my present. Reg is a present. I know, I really am a nerd. I got a veteranized tree in my garden, and it means that every morning I can see it out the window, and there's a little great tit been nesting. He's carrying a poo bag. So, this is 2 years ago, and the tree was done in the same year, 2012. So it's very exciting. I felt like I had a new baby. So the beetles, well, I have to say we have an awful lot of beetle and wasp and fly soup, because we collected from all the traps across, I think we did 16 sites in the end, and we've now identified them all. And again, I said to you, we haven't had any money, so a lot of this has been done on a voluntary basis. And currently we have huge long Excel sheets with all the species that have been found, but we need some money to do some analysis. But actually some things that are very interesting is we got some real heavyweights out of the beetle soup in particular. We got the hermit beetle, which was so exciting. And this particular one is the marble chafer. We also got noble chafer. We got more red data book species associated with the woodpecker holes and the nest boxes than we did the controls. But we did get one at the control too. So we really need to do some proper stats on it to see what the relationships are. But it's exciting. Then we had the flies, the bees, and the wasps. This one is an absolute cracker. It's a beauty. It is actually 6 meters tall. Sorry, no, it's not. But it likes sap runs. It particularly liked the climbing spikes. And I think, this is back to this point again, that these species are adapted and have evolved with trees. And they're able to sniff out these things in a way that we can't, or we've lost the ability to. And this particular species is usually associated with beech. But with the climbing spike damage, with the sap runs, this is coming into oak as well. Then there were lots of hornets. I've found hornets in quite a lot of the nest box type things that are making use of them. And again, that's a species that was very much in decline. Then there are other things associated with hornets. So, we're beginning to see the patterns. Then, of course, fungi. And actually, it's Emma should be telling you all about this because she knows much more than I do. See, you're getting the blame again. Next year, Simon. For me, fungi was always going to be the interesting one because it's the decay processes that I was interested in getting going with through damaging and torturing the trees. We all hear about dysfunction and the next step being decay. So, that's really what has been the main objective. And of course, we were really struggling to get some researchers to pick up the baton and move on it. And so I was so excited in 2017 when the Swedish Agricultural University, the mycology department, got some money for a master's student. And, said, Vikki, will you come with us? Yes, of course, I don't care if it's January. And they got some money to go and visit. I think we did 8 sites. And it was absolutely effing Baltic when we did this work. It was snowing horizontally, and I don't know how many minus it was. Actually, that is me there. You wouldn't know it because I've got so many clothes on. And that's when a squirrel came out and nearly bit one of us, by the way. And we took sawdust samples from 3 of the treatments. So we looked at control trees, we looked at the nest box and the woodpecker hole. Now, this data hasn't yet been published, and there's still more work to do, but we were blown away by the fact that there were 700 species. They call them operational taxonomic units, these folks that do DNA analysis, but basically that's equivalent to species. 700 species? I nearly fell over. The species richness is not different between the sites. So basically all trees were having at least 300 species each. And there was really not that much variation in species richness between sites and even between the treatments. But there's a difference in the species composition between the control trees and the trees that we've damaged. Actually, we looked at horse damage as well. So it's very exciting. Then the other thing that kind of blew me away was that only 25% of those 700 species they identified could actually be identified, so that we had DNA for. Only 10% have been recorded from Sweden before. I mean, it's mad. It just shows you how little we know, doesn't it? Yes. And equally, these two species that I'm not going to say the name, but you can see it on the screen. One of them on the top was only found and scientifically recorded from Sweden as a fruit body last year for the first time. And that was the most common species that we found in the DNA sequences. We did find chicken of the woods, and we did find beefsteak, but you can see they were actually only from very few trees. 5 trees. The beefsteak was from the control tree, which is very interesting, isn't it? So it was a real shocker, actually. I know that this isn't a surprise to those of you who've been working with fungi and DNA analysis, that there are so many species. But this has led to a 3-year project in Norway called The Secret Life of Oaks. So they're looking at endophytes in oak. That project's starting now. And, you know, I guess maybe this isn't news to any of you or to me, but I guess we're thinking that these decay fungi probably have got a latent phase or an endophytic phase in their lives. That this whole thing about, you know, fungi coming in, we've got to change all our prepositions, I think, based on some of this work and others. But what was also very interesting was that we had very, very little decay, virtually none. And again, this is back to trusting in trees, that these are young trees, of course. They were all very vital trees, and that's very important, of course. And the decay, I was a bit disappointed, I have to admit, because I was really hoping that there would have been a bit more decay happening than there actually was. So, you know, what happens next? Well, we've got a hell of a lot of beetles and insects and flies and wasps to analyze. And we're really hoping that another funding application is going to be successful for a PhD project. It would be great to look at all the sites and maybe do some other work in 5 years' time. I'd like to go back and look at all the trees again, because each time you go, you learn so much. You see so much happening that you perhaps didn't even think about. The questions that we're asking, there may be different answers. We may need to change the questions that we're asking. And I also think that we're learning, or for me anyway, I've been learning so much about other things. So mortality rates. You know, you ask a stupid question like, what's the normal mortality rate for oak? We actually don't know the answer to that question. We've got lots of really good forestry data about it, but we don't have very good data about oak in a natural wood pasture type situation. This may be something that can help us answer one of those questions. You know, what species succession do we get? Which ones come first, second, last? What stages, how long does it take? When will it feel like it's no longer clear that this has been done by a chainsaw and the natural processes will completely take over? You know, all of those sorts of questions, and I'm sure more, will come. This is actually one of the, I mean, you can hardly tell that this has been done. So now I just want to show you a few pictures showing kind of when they were done and a few years later. So this is actually from Hatfield Forest. So this one here is 20 years old. This is the sledgehammer stuff. And I can actually get my whole fist in that hole at the base of the trunk. So 20 years is maybe what it's taking before you wouldn't know if you went and looked at that it had been done by a sledgehammer, would you? And it's only because I've got a tag on it that I know myself that it was done by a sledgehammer. These ones we set fire to and barbecued some sausages. But actually this was 2 years later, and it actually just looked like there was really damage on this side. But after 10 years, it's actually 2/3 of the way round exposing the wood there. And the tree ant, one of the Lasius species, has moved in here now as well. So, you know, these are all things that we're learning. And only now you're seeing evidence in the crown of this damage, which is also quite interesting, I think, that presumably the roots were damaged first, and then the crown is responding. So, this is always the thing that I get frustrated with tree management, that everything takes such a bloody long time, isn't it? That if somebody digs through the roots to put in cable, it's only 20 years later you see the results. This is some horse damage 5 years on. You can see there's a little hole forming here and here. This is the woodpecker hole, so you can see the kind of, some of these are almost fully occluded. One of the ones that we did at Hatfield, I can get my finger in, that's all. This is some of the lovely nesting material, and it's great just to see, how they look after 5 years. You would hardly know that we'd been there. What's also interesting, though, actually, just very quickly on this, the kind of callus growth on the edge, you can actually see the form of the chainsaw on the wound wood there on the edges. So, are we on the right track? I see I've got a yellow light, that's good. This is woodpeckers, been very busy on the lid of the box. Inoculation, I know that Lynn Boddy and others are working on inoculation, and we've done some work in Sweden too, and the results are promising. That's the future, perhaps, if we really want to get the fungi going. We've got so much to learn, but of course, these will never be a replacement for our ancient trees in 400 years. They're a complement, and they must only be seen as a complement. They're a nature conservation tool. This are my kids, actually, a few years ago, and I think veteranisation, whilst it's a great tool and we ought to make our toolbox bigger, we must make sure we look after these as well. And that patience is a virtue. Somebody told me the tree was kissing me. You look at it sideways. But patience, and I'm not renowned for my patience, but I think that's the thing. This is going to, the slightly cocky approach that it was 25 years is when we're going to see the results, I think is probably pretty spot on. It may even take longer. So thank you. And these are the people who've been doing all the hard work with the fungi stuff. So just like to, mention them too. So thank you very much.